So, welcome back to another Thursday on the Pagan Perspective. I'm your Thursday host, Yeka. And this week we have been talking about pop pantheons. So, our question comes from Kristen, who writes, "It might be fun to hear you guys talk about pop pantheons. What do you think of them? If you were to pick some god, goddess figures, who would they be?" So I'm always kind of in a little bit of a tricky place when we have questions about gods because I'm a pagan and there's a lot of us out there. Um, I would guess we're probably not the majority, but I'm someone who doesn't believe in gods, doesn't use gods or deities in my practice. Now, this question, of course, is more about in pop culture, so I kind of interpreted that as in fictional works. Um, so one could recognize that just because we don't believe in something in real life doesn't mean that we don't appreciate or enjoy it in fiction. But I wanted to kind of to be a little bit more personal with this one, and say that I could go into say like, oh yeah, like I know a lot about the gods of Faerun, right, or those sort of things, but because I don't use gods in my practice, a lot of people who do are often curious, what does that actually look like? What's that framework? So for me, where I'm coming from with that is I view humans as part of nature, as opposed to the other way around. I don't think that nature is part of humans. That nature is the bigger picture that we fit into, not the other way around. And so a lot of deities or gods are often ideas or personifications of nature, of concepts um, like, love or war or things like that. And that particular view is a very kind of human centric one. And for me as a pagan, one of the big, I guess, themes or things that I really try to focus on is the viewing of myself within this larger within the larger context of nature, which is sort of is the larger reality. So that's why gods don't usually work so much for me. So something from pop culture, I was trying to think about, well, what is some sort of story, books or movies or shows or something that reflects that worldview and kind of what would be the closest thing to maybe a deity within that. And what I came up with is my all-time favorite book series, like that there is for me. You know how some people have their book. Well, these are what for me, and that's the Mars trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson. So Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars. So much so, it's actually a tradition in my family to name people from books. Like I was named from The Lord of the Rings. My name is Arwen, and my mother was named from her mother's favorite book series, and we named my daughter from the Mars trilogy. So it's an excellent, probably some of the best hard sci-fi out there, published in I think the early 90s, maybe even late 80s. And the series is just a very well done, very long, very slow paced series about the first people and their descendants to move to Mars. And there's a particular group. There's a lot of different. It's about basically the birthing of this new branch of humanity, and the author explores all of these different kinds of concepts. But one of the most influential groups is led by a woman named Hiroko, and they're kind of like, they basically become like pagans practicing permaculture on Mars, and it's wonderful. And they have this whole thing about becoming part of dealing with a lot about land ethics and all of these really interesting questions. But one of the concepts that's really important throughout the whole book, and specifically represented by this particular group, is the idea of Verretitas. And I think the author borrowed that term from somewhere else, but Verretitas is, the idea of it is, it's the greening of. So that's the root is the bringing forth, the greening from Latin. And it is, the idea is the spreading of life, the lushening, the greening, the continual expansion of complex patterns through the universe. And that, to me, is, I suppose, the closest thing to deity for me, is that idea. And that's something that I believe very strongly in. For for all of you familiar with ecology or biology out there, the idea of primary succession. Verretitas really is primary succession. It is the so the lava has come and formed a new island, and the first bits of life that start to pop up and spring up on that, or the asphalt that has the root and has the plant that pops up through it, and that's spreading. So in this series, they're looking at another planet, and there's all of this really interesting kind of moral and ethical stuff about, what right do we have and all of that. But this group thinks that that is part of who we are, that we are part of the Verretitas, and that we move it forth through in the world, through the universe, and we are a vector for that, and it's something beautiful and incredible. And I think that although it is a fictional, obviously, it's a story about possible futures and people who don't actually exist, and it takes place in a fictional setting, that concept to me is a very real concept. It's a name for something that I didn't know had a name and a concept, and that, for me, is a central part of what being pagan is, and the closest thing to what deity is. So I suppose that would be the god or goddess figure that I would choose if I had to choose one. So we'd love to hear in the comments from all of you if you have something, one of the pantheons or a deity or something like that from pop culture that you're interested in. I would also love to hear if any of you have read or listened. I think it's a really good book. Those are good books to listen to the Mars trilogy or things like that. Let us know in the comments, and see you next week.